Welcome to today's webinar from AI Guardian. My name is Chris Hackney. I'm the founder and CEO of AI Guardian. Our mission in this important space is to help companies with their governance and compliance. And there's no more important subject than today's subject on that. The EU AI Act is going to have a major impact on overall governance efforts of companies across the world, very similar to GDPR and other legislation that came out of the EU. So today's webinar is focused on that. We're going to take a deep dive into the EU AI Act, its core components, what you need to know about it, what you need to do to be prepared for it today and to get ready for it. It's part of our ongoing webinar series on AI regulation. So we hope you check out our other series webinars and materials at aiguardianapp.com. That will also be on the last slide if you didn't write that down quickly as well. So let's get started. So what we're going to go through today is preparing your business for the EU AI Act. It's by far the leading global regulation on AI, and it's coming pretty quickly this year and into 2025. What will help you understand are the core principles and the risk-based regulatory approach that the EU Parliament has taken in putting this together. We'll define AI system types because this is a risk-based regulatory approach. It's defined by the type of system and the use cases of it. There are 4 classifications. They are prohibited use cases, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk. Each of those come with their own compliance requirements and components. We think here at AI Guardian that the EU has done a smart job really tying regulation to the risk profile of models in their applications, and we'll talk through what those compliance requirements are. And then we'll also talk enforcement timelines and penalty structure. Like I said, this is kind of coming into enforcement this year in 2024. It will be in heavy enforcement in 2025. And we'll talk about that structure and timeline. And then finally, for those who are managing their own businesses and their own AI integration, we'll talk about what you need to do to prepare your business for it today. And importantly, for AI integrations, please understand, while we talk a lot about generative AI today, a lot of this has coverage over subcomponents of AI. Machine learning, NLP, or natural language processing are coming under heavy scrutiny given the advancements on the generative AI front and are inclusive here. So we'll cover these today. We'll leave time for some questions at the end. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll cover those as we go along or at the end, in time permitting. So for 2023, we had a busy year on the regulation front. There were over 1,000 AI laws and regulations passed or proposed globally. About 17% of those were actually passed in territories, states, country levels. And for us in tech, this is coming much quicker than it has in other previous tech waves. Governments are extremely serious and nervous about generative AI and what it can do, and they're trying to get ahead of it as it moves forward. There has been nothing more important and nothing moving more fast or faster than the EU AI Act. This for Europe, this is a unprecedented pace. Took them 6 months or less to codify this, from the beginning of negotiations through final parliamentary approval this last month. It should be published in the official journal in this quarter, in Q2 of 2024, which means initial enforcement will start for prohibited use cases will start at the end of the year, and full enforcement will start in 2025. So the core principles, what is the EU AI Act trying to accomplish? And it's actually trying to accomplish some really good things. It's trying to provide AI developers and deployers with clear requirements and obligations regarding the use cases of the AI that they're creating or using. There's a lot of confusion out there about what should I do in governance around these subjects. And when you have a Wild West environment, people are really skittish to slow down their own efforts if there's not rule sets in place of what should be required. And so it's seeking to streamline the administrative, financial burdens and requirements into very clear instructions, particularly for larger enterprises, and while keeping minimal onus or requirements on small and medium-sized businesses and enterprises. They're really focused on the biggest players, the ones who can have the greatest impact uh, with this regulation. It is comprehensive legal framework on AI. It is extraterritorial. Just like GDPR, it means it has governance over any company anywhere in the world if those companies are trying to function and market their models and applications in the EU territories. So if you do business in EU territory, no matter where you're headquartered, you need to conform to these requirements. So overall, it's laying out those ground rules. It does a really good job on laying out the fundamental rights, safety, and ethical principles that are, for those who are in the responsible AI space, know it well, but kind of lays those pieces and frameworks into the regulation they put together. Um, what does it specifically enable? So first, it addresses risks specifically created by AI applications. This is a new technology with its own risks inherent into it, especially on some of those ethical principles. So it goes after that and tries to lay out a framework for that. It prohibits certain AI practices that universally there's a lot of concern about with the new technology and the application of. And so they've laid those out very clearly. There's an accelerated timeline for 2024 on prohibiting those practices. But then it also determines a list of high-risk applications. Where are the areas where there can be high positive impact, but in certain cases, high negative societal impact. And so they lay out what those high-risk applications are, and they set clear requirements, compliance requirements for those systems, and what you need to do to deliver to the EU office on this. There are required conformity assessments as a part of that. We'll talk about later. There's also fundamental rights impact assessments. But there's a series of steps, both internal and external, that companies are going to have to take for their own compliance before they put it on the EU market. And then it puts an enforcement mechanism in place with fines and other pieces tied to it that are also there to oversee AI efforts. And then for the EU itself, it establishes a governance structure at both the European and national levels. That's the activity that's going on now as we lead to publication of it in a month or so ahead. So these are the overall kind of areas it's designed to enable that you're going to have to think about as you bring AI into the EU market itself. So let's start with the basics. First and foremost, there's a lot of confusion about what an AI system is. So the EU AI Act starts by defining that and using that as the bedrock for the rest of the stratification of AI use cases that it goes after. But in the EU's mindset, the definition of an AI system is this: a machine-based system that infers the input it receives, how to generate output such as predictions, content, recommendations, or decisions that it can affect physical or virtual environments. So this is what we see a lot in generative AI with neural networks that are inferring, significant training data to then infer conclusions. So this can cover generative AI, as I said earlier. It can also cover machine learning or NLP. So if you're operating in any of these spaces, consider yourself inclusive of the EU AI Act's boundaries as far as this definition is concerned. Now, when we talk about a risk-based approach, they've defined 4 levels of AI systems that are shown here. The first is those prohibited or unacceptable risk categories. These are areas like facial recognition, especially used for things like law enforcement and broad use cases, subliminal manipulation, social scoring, areas where overall there is a lot of concern about the impact of a generative AI system at scale and what its societal ramifications might be. Second area is applications with high risk. These could be high-risk categories under themselves or verticals like healthcare, insurance, financial decisions, but anywhere where there's a significant impact to the person or the community based on the recommendations a generative AI system might make or the content it creates. And this is where most of the compliance lives that we'll talk about later in this discussion. Third area is limited risk applications. These are EU is mainly focused on transparency with these, so being able to look under the hood, understand them versus stronger compliance measures. But this is heavy understanding and concern around ubiquitous uh, human AI activities, so such as chatbots in service areas. Generally not a big issue area. A lot of companies use these in their front line already, but where can this go off the rails? Where do we need to have transparency of what's happening? Same with content generation, with deepfakes, and other content that you'll see kind of start to flood publishing channels. So there's some limited risk and transparency they want to go over on those systems. And then finally is kind of their green safe zone with minimal risk applications. This is AI integrated into video games or industrial processes, etc. What we consider low lift areas where there's lower risk involved in the application of AI. So this is an area, this slide and these kind of designations are something you should absolutely have a firm understanding of if you do have risk management responsibilities around AI and its application in the EU AI Act. Okay. So let's talk about those prohibited ones. The exact definition used by the AI Act is these are AI systems that are deemed a clear threat to fundamental rights, safety, or livelihoods, and they are explicitly banned. There should be no use cases where you bring these to market. And so those prohibited AI systems that are outlined in Title II, Article 5 of the Act include social scoring systems with real-world ramifications, real-time biometric identification for law enforcement. This was probably one of the biggest sticking points of the negotiations was the severity of biometric and law enforcement use cases. Actual governments are excluded from the EU AI Act's overview. But as private companies, there was strong, in local law enforcement, there was strong concern about the use of these, and it's deeply embedded in the prohibited use cases. There's some broad ones here. Deceptive techniques to distort behavior could define a lot of things. I think a lot of companies are going to have to look for further guidance on what crosses a boundary of deceptive techniques. But there's probably a lot of concern around cybersecurity and cyber scamming. So, lying to people for financial benefit is probably going to fall deeply into that category. Exploiting vulnerable categories, there's there's a lot of concern about bias in generative AI systems and how that then extrapolates into vulnerable communities who might not understand the ramifications of the actions they're taking with a Gen AI system. Biometric categorizations, a little bit covered up above, criminal profiling at an individual level. There's a lot of room in the AI Act for clustering analysis to draw insights and extrapolate those out. But getting to profiling at individual levels is strictly prohibited. And then emotional inference in sensitive environments. How do people behave? How do we read people? Especially with facial recognition technology, is prohibited as well under the EU AI Act. So second area, high-risk AI systems. These are specifically systems that pose significant risks to fundamental rights or safety. As defined in the articles here on the slide, social scoring systems, again, with real-world consequences show up. Critical infrastructures that could put the life and health of citizens at risk. It's a lot of more, think your government infrastructures or technology infrastructures. What if someone shuts down using generative AI traffic light systems across a state or a country? Utilities like energy and electric. So a lot of those come under this purview. Education or vocational training that serves as a gatekeeper to what's considered critical life advancement access and like education. And that's where you see a lot of these. It comes in, it's education, it's finance, it's healthcare, it's insurance, anything where you see clear gatekeeper access from a Gen AI system where we're not comfortable yet with the impact of that. You've already seen that with some lawsuits with healthcare systems on their ML side around denial of care decisions based on generative AI involvement. So you'll see that kind of come into play as well. Anything that has to do with safety components of products, you see the example there. Same with employment, private and public services, credit scoring that ties onto the financial side, law enforcement that may interfere with people's fundamental rights. And then migration, asylum, and border control, that's more at the government side and the direction towards regulatory agencies on their side and the administration of justice and democratic processes. There's a strong concern with these systems on election interference and content. So they've got a broad definition of in the AI Act to guard against that as a high-risk system, anything that might touch on that. Okay. Now, these systems are where that compliance components comes into play. And so that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our discussion today. Based on their potential to have a material negative impact on widespread communities, there's a broad and stringent compliance system in place with the EUA Act for them that runs all the way through every life stage of the model. And when we talk about conformity assessments and the other compliance, it's actually defined by the life stages of the AI system. So from the point it's developed all the way through the point it's retired and decommissioned, there was a series of steps associated with conformity assessments and other assessments that have to be done. This is also true if any changes happen. What's important is on the right side, if there are any substantial changes in the model or applications, you go back to step 2 and you start over. And so they are very clear and they understand that systems are changing rapidly, but your compliance has to kind of keep refreshing every time you update in a material way the work in the model itself. Okay. So on compliance, let's talk conformity assessments first. This is the most robust area of compliance in the EU AI Act. And what it does is provides a robust framework for conducting evaluation and verification of the AI system itself. And we always say here at AI Guardian, a lot of compliance and governance is a series of rote checklists. It's the things you should do every time you're in a dangerous area like this, or potentially dangerous area. But they're pretty straightforward things, right? It's the basics I should do every time so that we have a 100% safety rate. And that's what the conformity assessments are asking companies to do. There are 2 pathways for conformity assessments, what's an internal pathway or an external one. Most of the time, internal assessments are going to be fine. 90% plus probably the use cases, internal assessments are going to be fine. External assessments are recommended in cases where there's external expertise or notified bodies that are particular to the industry, probably in areas like more likely in areas like finance, where you've got very strict regulatory environments already in place for notifications. But depending on several factors here that we've listed, the biggest ones are between internal and external complexity AI system. If there's novel functionalities and it's highly complex, you're going to need to rely on outside expertise in those notified bodies. If you have internal expertise, if you have a strong track record of AI development and quality management, you're probably best served by doing internal assessments, and that's allowed under the Act. And then resource availability. Some companies have this expertise internally and resources available. Many are going to have to work with outside parties, consultants, legal firms, etc., to help them finish out this work. Now, when we look at conformity assessments, there's 3 components that are the primary focus. First is what we call an internal review protocol. This is the bulk of it. This is the kind of the tool and framework for making sure you have quality assurance and risk management in place around the models and applications you're employing. So this will cover a ton of basics. It's about, like I said, it's defined by life cycle of the model, but it's defined by a standard checklist of checks and balances through the development to retirement period. And that can include things like fundamental rights impact assessments. We're going to talk about it, ethics assessments. We've got a full detail on that on our blog for those who want to dive in. But the bulk of it is a series of steps, just like when you do SOC 2 compliance or other compliance measures. that you have to go through and present statements on of completion, as well as documentation for. The second component is the summary data sheet, or the SDS. This is actually the kind of couple-page form that gets submitted to the EU office and put in their public database that is still being worked on, by the way, to make sure there's a public record and a tracked record on their side of your models and your compliance with the EU AI Act. The third area is one that is just recommended. It's optional, but it's recommended as a best practice as an external scorecard, or the ESC. We highly recommend this. It's almost like if you go to a restaurant and you see the health report that's publicly posted, it's the same thing here. It's a public health report for your models. We would expect you should do this as a best practice, but we would expect that there's going to be a lot of RFPs that require this from business vendors shortly as a template. But basically, it publicly states for your AI systems the key four dimensions of them. What's the purpose of these systems? What are the values going in, as well as the data? And then what are the governments you're doing around it, and what's your compliance with that? So think of that as an additional step you can take as a best practice. So conjointly, all of these provide a way to comprehensively audit your governance with your generative AI systems and allows organizations to demonstrate the conformance of those with the EU AI Act itself. Okay. The other spotlight area we want to talk about today is fundamental rights impact assessments. These are a little more broadly defined in the current AI Act. We would expect them to have further definition down the road. But EU governing bodies are extremely concerned about what are the rights of communities and individuals that might be impacted negatively by AI systems. So it's a systemic examination of potential risks that an AI system might pose to those fundamental rights. So what they're asking you to do is upfront really think through what are the negative things that could happen and the risks that could be unleashed because of what you're building. And before you deploy it, you should have gone through that exercise. You should have noted where you can make improvements or track that so that as those risks might develop, you have an eye and transparency on it to address them. But these rights are, cover areas like privacy, non-discrimination, bias areas, freedom of expression, political areas, and safety, things we consider in the Western world, at least in this case, so the EU AI Act, as the most important aspects of our communities. The process itself involves analyzing the system's design, development, deployment, and intended use, all of those life stages, to identify potential issues and develop mitigation strategies. So what are the things we can do to bring down those risks? Okay. Why are these important? AI systems are a unique technology that has the potential both for good and negative situations to really kind of scale up quickly and have a wide impact through their adoption. And we're most concerned about AI systems because of our own concerns about ourselves. We, with our data and activities, bring human biases and discrimination into certain environments and against certain demographics. And the potential for computer and algorithmic systems to amplify those quickly is troubling to a lot of folks in these areas. And so what they're trying to do is make sure we think through these issues before we launch. So FRIAs are designed to kind of cover those bases. They're designed as a proactive measure to help identify and address them, make sure everyone's really thought through and you can document that. But most importantly, they want you to demonstrate responsible AI practices. What are all the things you've done to adopt responsible AI and bring it into your environment? What have you done to mitigate risks up front and avoid costly issues on the back end? And then third, they're designed to make sure you really have improved your transparency and explainability. Can you look under the hood of these systems and really understand what's going on, especially in real time as a bias or some other complication might develop? So they really want you to come in and be able to document and show that upfront with these assessments. So those are the primary components of high risk systems. Let's talk a little more about the last two, limited risk AI systems. So these are defined as general purpose AI, or what's called in a lot of the technical documentation GPAI, as defined in the article here. But they basically defined as those that pose minimal risk to fundamental rights versus safety in general. They still could have risk associated with them, but this is areas like spam filters, something that AI that might help you manage your email inbox. Could that tread into areas of expression or content? Sure, based on what gets shown to you or not. But the ceiling on that risk is a little lower than what we described before. Customer service chatbots, the things that are upfront with you, helping you navigate an issue. Again, these are mostly automated exchanges with customers and frontline. Some risk there of a bias introducing itself, but the stakes or the impact is much lower here. Same with, and they were very careful in the definition of simple image or video filters. Deep fake technology, heavily manipulated technology of video, audio, images is in that high risk category, right? But here, simpler things like a TikTok filter falls under these that might be, which is already in place in social systems. It might adjust your brightness, how you look a little bit, do something fun or interesting with the photos you do. Um, uh, but they don't also tread into facial recognition or emotional analysis. It's just for the kind of fun filtering side. Those all fall under limited risk systems in general purpose. So on oversight, like I said earlier, there's not heavy compliance requirements here, but there is a strong push by the EU to have these companies and these systems adhere to best practices voluntarily without being complied yet. Now, if we have big events that cause sentiment to shift on AI, that volunteer might become a required compliance item later. But what they want limited risk AI systems to do is to kind of embrace what high risk systems have to do because they're just good governance. And so conducting risk assessments, it might not be a full conformity assessment, but you should be evaluating your AI systems for potential risks and have a risk management system around that to mitigate those risks. Developing technical documentation. This gets back to a level of transparency. Do you have documentation outlining the system's development process, data, functionalities, outputs? Is that something that's shared across the entire team and there's broad understanding of it within your organization? So they're looking for that. And then self-declaration compliance. Hey, like we said on the ESCs, external scorecards, do you have something that in some ways with your customers or outside affected parties declares that your systems adhere to the act's requirements, which are really good governance and responsible AI requirements? So they're looking for you to take some public stance on those and build trust with these systems based on that. Okay. And then last, we have minimal risk AI systems, which also fall under the technical definition of general purpose in the Act. These systems are deemed unlikely to cause harm. Even on the edge use cases, the likelihood of harm or strong impact is minimal. So they face minimal regulatory requirements, but continued encouragement of governance best practices. So simple games with AI elements, mobile games that kind of affect character behavior of others you might interact with in that system are covered under here. Spam detection algorithms, the ability to kind of weed out negative things coming into your world. Basic educational tools, basic things that can help you on like learning a new language or, math or any other subject you might be interested in, and AI can help. Great. Basic recommendation systems. You'll see this in retail a lot, in online shopping, or music streaming or content. But what's a basic recommendation system based on your previous history falls under this. And then AI-powered image enhancement tools. Again, this falls again here, but there's some slight stylistic differences between some of those that fall under limited and some of those that fall under minimal. So if you fall under here, best practices are still encouraged, but not required by the Act. So let's talk. We've defined the risk categories, and we've kind of talked about the compliance within those. Let's talk about enforcement timelines. Right now, and this is a little bit of a moving target, because everything really kicks off by publication of the act in the official journal of the European Union. From that point, the clock is ticking towards enforcement periods. That exact date, as of the beginning of April here, has not been set, but we expect it to be short in the next 30 days. It's more of a translating the approved act into the multiple languages of the EU, documenting all that. That's what's holding that up. There's no more votes to be taken for it. Once that happens, you see in the chart below, prohibited AI practices, enforcement of those goes into effect 6 months from that point. So we expect that in Q4 of this year. General purpose AI overview is 1 year from enactment. So we expect that in Q2 of 2025 to start to be enforced. And then overall compliance, and particularly of those compliance elements of the high risk systems, is 2 years from enactment. So we would imagine those come into play Q1, maybe Q2 of 2026. But companies, there's a lot of work on those that companies have to do to have them ready by that date. So we're going to see most companies in the world really doing the bulk of that work late this year and into 2025 to be ready for those deadlines in 2026. The other interesting part too is the act, while a broad enforcement mechanism for the territory of the EU, actually has a lot of structural components in place to help encourage the other member states, each individual country, to do more work on this. So we would fully expect certain countries like Germany, France, UK, Italy, to come out with their own additional regulations on top of this for being able to bring AI to market in their countries, just like we see in the US federal level regulation, White House level regulation, and state level, right? So just be on the lookout that this is the model legislation that a lot of those countries will use, and then from there they'll adapt it for their own needs by country. Okay. Penalty structures for this are quite steep. So I think the EU learned with GDPR that the high enforcement standards, while only employed in a few instances, those instances are strong signals to the rest of the market to get in line with its edicts. And so the EU AI Act has significant teeth here. The penalties range from 1.5% to 7% of a firm's global sales revenue, based on the violation type. And obviously, the starting point for this is supply of incorrect, incomplete, or misleading information. If you don't do your paperwork properly, or you mislead in what you submit, there's up to a 1.5% potential fine of your global revenue, or in the EU parlance, turnover. Violation of AI Act obligations, so not submitting materials required or transparency on what you're doing, is obviously a level of severity higher. That's up to 3% of that global revenue. And then obviously stiffest penalties are for violation of banned AI applications as prohibited ones. Or what's particularly important to the EU is non-compliance related to requirements on data. They've got very strict regulation on the biggest players in the world in generative AI, their model requirements and their data requirement disclosure. So anything that's banned or in that realm is the stiffest penalties of up to 7% of global revenue under it. Okay. Penalties will be determined based on the severity of the infringement, based on the judgment of the newly created European AI office. And they really kind of define everything. They've got technical definition of what's a minor infraction versus a significant infraction. And these are important to understand within the context of those violations that it can occur. Minor infractions are, failing to provide adequate documentation or transparency, minor non-compliance of technical standards, inadequate implementation of user data protection measures with limited impact. A lot of times, when we've seen this previous in other regulatory environments, plus here, usually it's errors without intent, right? We did certain things and we didn't mean to violate, but we did. Usually that's treated a little less harshly than significant infractions where there was intent plus the action. And so when we look at significant infractions, deploying high-risk AI systems without conducting conformity assessments, FRIAs, et cetera, clear violation, significant infraction, shows intent. Using banned AI practices themselves, obviously significant. Significant breaches of data privacy or security, particularly involving sensitive data. There's a higher bar, as it is with all regulation, for firms who are privileged to have sensitive data. They have a responsibility to safeguard that at an extremely high level. And obviously having that breached comes with a significant infraction. And then impact is the last one. Noncompliance leading to direct harm to fundamental rights or public safety. There's significant community impact. There's going to be a much harder and higher penalty and structure around that than something less. So that's the penalty structure for the EU AI Act. Again, we would expect this also to be a case where they look at larger players first and work their way down in their evaluations, and then hopefully use those larger players as a guideline for where people need to be. So last section of this real quick. What should you be doing now? How do you need to be prepared for this? And like I said earlier, this is an extraterritorial regulatory act, which means it doesn't matter where you are in the world. At the end of the day, if you do any business with the EU in those markets, you're going to have to conform globally to this act. And so in that way, we really feel this is something that almost every company, especially your larger companies in the world, are going to have to conform with, just like they do with GDPR and other legislation that's come from there or regulation that's come from there. So when we talk to our partners, we tell them you've got a wonderful window right now to be prepared. And it gives you an opportunity for you to kind of prepare and bring responsible AI best practices into your environments. Because at the end of the day, if you're familiar with NIST AI RMF here in the US or other frameworks around responsible AI, EU AI Act is just simply a regulation that builds off the back of those frameworks. And if you're complying with those frameworks and leading with responsible AI, you're covering 90% of the bases of the EU AI Act already as you dig into it. And so what we say is, first, you need to be able to map what you're doing today, the systems you're using, the applications, and their use cases, so that you can understand from a risk-based regulation approach what falls into each of those risk categories. But you absolutely need to determine which systems and models are within the scope. Well, first, what you have and when you do, what falls within the Act scope, and conduct gap analysis against key requirements. You need to do that in a centralized system of record. There needs to be documentation to it. You can't just do this through a PowerPoint and an Excel spreadsheet. You really need a true software solution that has something that can be dipped into and used across a broad team at your organization. Second, you absolutely need to strengthen your data governance. We talked about that on kind of significant infractions in the last slide. But there is going to have to be enhanced methods for both how you collect data, store it, and then how you use it. And this is very similar to GDPR, when it really was about how did you get that consumer data? How do you tag it, track it, use it, so that you have a right to keep it? The same thing's going to be here. There's going to be a lot of questions around how did you gather your data? How do you intend to use it? Are those fair use cases? And do you have full transparency and risk mitigation around that? Especially in a world where there's generative AI and other AI techniques on the cybersecurity side that are going to come after your data and try and breach it. So there's a lot of concern about companies not having significant enough cybersecurity and data protection. And you have a window now to strengthen that before that becomes pronounced as an issue. Third area, align with technical standards. Keep abreast of emerging technical standards that will define the compliance specifics. Like I said, a good chunk of what is being asked for in the Act is defined in what's been passed, but the specifics of what is a FRIA, what is a conformity assessment, and what's the everyone wants to look out and go, well, just give me the form for that and I'll fill it out. Those are still being worked on right now. We've built much of that into our own system here at AI Guardian as a SaaS software solution. But I think you'll continue to see them put out recommendations on suggested forms and ways of submitting over the next year or so as we get close to that enforcement period. Fourth area, make sure you're integrating with existing regulations. There's a lot of government body agencies who already feel like they have oversight of these issues. And while the EU AI Act is a global regulation, you're still going to see a lot of agencies come in with their own perspective here and move quickly like they did with other regulation. So if you're in finance and you deal with the SEC or hell, the FDA from a healthcare perspective, all these agencies are also going to use probably elements of the Act, the UA Act, as model legislation by which they continue to build on top of their own regulations here. Okay. Fifth area, last couple here. You should start doing FRIAs and conformity assessments today. We've got that capability in our system. Others have built that out a little bit as well, but this is an area where practice makes perfect. It should become a muscle memory action of a company. And again, these are all just good governance aspects that should be done anyways, just more in a structured regulatory approach. But we highly recommend that companies, while enforcement doesn't start for a little bit, they should be using this time to build those capabilities through their organizations and develop that muscle memory in line with these type of compliance requirements. And then obviously, like I said up front, investing in AI governance solutions. You need something that's a structured system of record to bring this all together, to bring your teams together, to do it in a cost-effective and frictionless way. So we highly recommend making that investment now, getting teams into those systems, starting to use them, and then having that documentation in a singular place as well at this point. So last point I'll say here, when we talk about governance foundational best practices, because everyone says, well, where do I get started? These are the 5 we're telling people right now you absolutely should be doing. You should be setting up an AI committee to have oversight of these issues, understand these issues, drives both action and communication across the org on what you're doing here so that you can run as fast as possible with your AI integrations and adoption. Second thing, issue a sensible AI policy. Most of the folks we deal with and partners we deal with today, they have what we call a thou shall not policy. They've gone out usually through a legal memorandum or something from general counsel or the CISO telling you what you can't do with AI at the organization. That's working for a little bit here, but it's obviously creating friction with the company's overall innovation, other leaders trying to adopt AI because they're not being told how to use AI responsibly. And so we strongly recommend that you start to develop a sensible AI policy that tells people how they should use AI responsibly and sets those guidelines and checks and balances across the org to feel comfortable with the risk you're taking on as groups do that. We have some of those policies on our website as well as templates that you can use. So you can visit our website or create your own with your own legal counsel. Third, AI project mapping. Like I said up front, the greatest sin of most companies right now we're dealing with is that they have no idea, especially at a C-suite level, of all of the AI projects that are underway at their own company. And that's just a recipe for disaster. It's a very basic thing to do to map that out, but it's absolutely essential. And so we're telling every company and partner we deal with, please, please, please map those projects out. Make sure you at least have accountability built into your organization on these as people continue to run fast by department. Fourth one, establish AI project approval criteria. Not only on responsible AI components and saying, hey, we need to understand who needs to approve these to make sure they're properly governed, but also on impact. Is this a project that is worth the risk profile right now of us doing it? Is it going to have a material impact to our business and our customers? There should be a project approval, just like for any other project, both on the risk structure side of it, but also the impact side of it. And that should run through something that runs through that AI committee at a universal level, but also through the project teams themselves, bottom up through the project teams, top down through the approval and oversight groups on risk management here. And then lastly, like I said, manage that in a centralized system. You do need a system of record for this, just like you've needed in other areas, like with GDPR. We highly, highly recommend you get out of email, you get out of Slack, you get out of Excel sheets and docs into a centralized system that is properly scaled and is built out the functionality that is unique to AI governance as you move forward. So on that note, we've covered all the bases. Like I said, AI governance is our business here at AI Guardian. As you need help on that, please check us out on LinkedIn. We've got robust content in this space and on these topics in real time there. We've also got a lot of content on our site, aiguardianapp.com. And you can check out our blogs, our other resources, free resources. But as a SaaS software solution helping companies and partners in the space, our goal here is to educate first through these webinars and other activities, and then hopefully find partners who are looking to implement as we move forward. So on that note, I will stop sharing the presentation. We did, again, please, in the chat, submit any questions you had. We did get a few come in through the presentation. So with the time we have remaining, I'll answer those real quick. So first question was on the EU AI Act and these requirements. Is this a per organization requirement and compliance, or is it per model and application? That's a good question. It's one that comes up a lot. It's per model and application right now. And like I said up front, as those models change materially, you have to start over again. You have to take your previous submissions and compliance and update it. So think of it as something comprehensive that's going to be part of that DNA of what your organization does as it moves forward today. Okay. Second question. Do templates exist for the compliance requirements you guys talked about? Some do. We've created some in our own systems based on what we think are best practices, along with interpretation of the articles of the EU AI Act. But I expect, and those are probably about 90% on target. It's the best thing you can use today. But I would expect further guidance to continue to come out as this advances and as the dates get closer, particularly as outside agencies who the European Union typically works with provide their input on what a best practice would be. OECD and some of those agencies, you would expect probably more of that than to help inform. Okay. And then the question, how solid is the timelines that were presented for publication and enforcement? I'd say they're really solid at this point. It passed European Parliament last month by an overwhelming majority. There is solid support across the board. Certain countries have their own parts of it that they feel stronger or less about. France particularly has wanted less regulation on this. They feel like they've got a burgeoning AI industry in their country they want to promote, and they don't want regulation to slow it down, versus other countries like Germany and Italy have wanted stronger regulation. So you'll have those tensions, but overall, as a territory, they're pretty far along in unanimity of wanting to have this done, have it done quickly. It got passed, particularly December into this year, to get it in before elections in most of the countries happen, so they can lock in the regulation before election disruption causes uncertainty. So I think you'll continue to see them push strongly as a global leader on regulation through this measure, and probably additional addendums to it. Okay. And then last question was, do we see other regulation coming? We do. Particularly, we're a US-based company. We particularly see this being used as model legislation for a host of state-level regulation. You'll probably see states like California, New York move quickly as fast followers to put their own fingerprints on regulation here. We will continue to see the White House move quickly. The executive orders have already been issued. Regulatory agencies are already moving forward with pretty strict AI governance requirements embedded in them that will flow through agencies like the FDA or SEC. The one area we don't see it is congressional. We have paralysis in that body. We don't foresee that changing even with the election at the end of this year, 2024. So we'll probably see most of the U.S. regulatory leadership come from the state level and the White House level, just because of how those two bodies function versus Congress right now. We would expect to see a lot more activity also out of Asia. China particularly has strong opinions on this regulation coming from a slightly different bent. Again, when I talked about the fundamental rights of the Western world, those viewpoints are very different than some parts of the Eastern world like China. And so I think you're going to see them focus on certain areas that are a little different. Data security, control of message and content, probably like other regulation is going to be more important to them. So you'll see different avenues taken, but an intense focus there on that side. But that's where we see most of the regulation starting to triangulate and drive towards as the year progresses. But we particularly see regulation moving fast compared to historic norms, and to the enforcement to be something that's probably pretty heavy-handed once it comes in. You've always got these cycles in technology where you build something up, right? You put it on a pillar, and that's a cycle we're at now with generative AI. But there's real concerns of governments' populations around generative AI, and you're going to have a couple of events that probably scare people and turn those sentiments even more negative. And you'll probably see governments want to jump in very quickly to allay those concerns, feel like they're doing something in the space and protecting people. And so you'll see a lot of heavy-handed probably regulation come as those events unfold. So we would expect a decent amount of regulation coming across the globe there. So on that note, those were all the questions we have in the chat. We sincerely appreciate everyone's time. Hopefully you got a lot out of this. This is a rapidly evolving space, so we will continue to update materials and educate on the EUA Act along with the other regulation that's coming. So please visit our website, stay informed, follow us on LinkedIn, where we do a lot of our content, and we hope to stay in touch with you.